Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 9, Social Psychology. In this chapter, we're going to talk a lot about how people interact with each other and what different psychological phenomenon take place when these interactions happen. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into this. So Chapter 9, Social Psychology. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about a few different things. Again, specifically, we're going to start off here talking about just generally how people interact with each other and how we can ascribe different beliefs to why people perform different actions and behaviors that we see them perform, both to others and also ourselves. So the first kind of component we're going to talk about here is called attribution theory. So this theory kind of states or discusses this idea of how we ascribe different beliefs to our own actions versus others' actions. And generally, when we're talking about how we prescribe these beliefs, we can talk about two different ways that we can attribute the reasons why we behave in certain ways. That is through either internal components or external components. So if you talk about any type of behavior and why someone performed that behavior, you can ascribe the reason to either internal reasons or external reasons to why that behavior took place. And so if we look at this, we can kind of see how this kind of plays out, especially here in this example on the screen. So if a behavior is related to something that they perform internally or their internal aspects kind of dictate, we would call this a dispositional attribution. On the other hand, if their behavior is due to some external or outside forces, we would make some situational attribution, saying that they perform that behavior due to some situation that was outside of their control. So if we look at some examples of this, we can say, let's take a coworker, in this case, Jane, and try and figure out why maybe Jane was late for work. So we might attribute the reason Jane is late for work internally to internal reasons. And that might be because, well, Jane is someone who tends to be slow at getting ready and they don't do a lot of time management. And for these reasons, they are always kind of late and they tend to be late to work. But these are internal reasons about Jane, and that's why they were late to work. On the other hand, we could maybe ascribe external reasons to why the behavior of being late to work took place. Maybe that's because there was a lot of traffic that day, or there was an accident on the road, and that kind of caused Jane to have to take a different route, which made her late to work. And these are reasons that are outside or external of Jane's control, and we could ascribe these reasons for that behavior as well. So again, distinguishing between the internal and external reasons of how we can ascribe to behavior. Now, what's interesting about this is that we can kind of look and see when we might choose internal versus when we might choose external attributions. And part of this is due to whether we are looking at someone else versus ourselves, but also due to these three different components of this model of attributions, specifically Kelly's covariation model of attributions. So here we can look at consistency. First off, how often is this happening? So is Jane late to work most of the time? Is Jane consistently late to work? We can look at distinctiveness. So is Jane late in other contexts, or is it just when she's arriving at work? And so we can see in this case, the distinctiveness aspect, is it just in this context, or does this behavior expand to other contexts as well? And lastly, we can look at consensus and say, were other people performing this behavior as well? So were other people late to work this day as well? Or was it just Jane who was late to work? And each of these three things helps dictate whether or not we're going to ascribe internal or external attributions. If Jane is late pretty consistently in a lot of different time points, that might be more of an internal attribution to why Jane is late rather than an external situational attribution. If this is distinctive, where it's just about being late to work, versus if Jane is late in all aspects of her life, we might dictate internal versus external reasons. And same with consensus. If other people are late that day as well, maybe that's an external reason that affected lots of people, versus if it's just Jane, it's maybe more likely to be attributed to an internal reason of why Jane was late. Now, when we look at how we ascribe these reasons to either ourselves or others, we are biased when looking at this distinction. And so we call this the fundamental attribution error, or there are these groups of fundamental attribution errors that we can distinguish and look at how we are biased in this way. So the first one is the actor-observer bias. And this generally says that we are more likely to ascribe situational or external causes to our own behavior and more likely to ascribe dispositional or internal causes to someone else's behavior. We also have the self-serving bias, and this generally says that when we're successful, we like to attribute that to our own internal behavior, our own internal causes of our behavior. Whereas when we fail, we like to ascribe that to some external cause. So if we did really well, it's because of us. We did a good job. Whereas if we didn't do well, it's more likely that we're going to ascribe that to some external cause outside of our control. And again, when we're ascribing different attributes to others, we can see that fundamental attribution error again, that we're more likely to focus on those internal reasons when assessing someone else versus external reasons when we assess ourselves. And then lastly, we have the false consensus effect, which is really thinking that everyone tends to agree with our own beliefs when that may not always be the case. So we're more biased in saying that the way we think about something is going to be how other people think about it when that may not actually be the case. The last two things we'll talk about here are impression formation and then also a little bit of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So impression formation is really how we make impressions about other people. And a lot of this kind of feeds from these different internal versus external causes. So we can see if we have a lot of internal attributions that we prescribe to people, we might be more likely to have stronger impressions about them as a person, whereas those external reasons might be more likely to say, okay, well, that was out of their control. And a big part of this also leads to confirmation bias. And so oftentimes what we do is we make a first impression very quickly, and then we look to confirm that impression. So if we see behaviors or attitudes that agree with that first impression, well, we're more likely to pay attention to those and just confirm our own feelings towards that person. Whereas if we see things that are contradictory to that behavior or that first impression, we tend to ignore that, and it doesn't likely change our impression. So first impressions really are important, and they also, again, we tend to look for ways to confirm those. And this can kind of lead to this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which can kind of cause some issues in how you behave and how you kind of view yourself compared to others. So oftentimes what you might do is you might have some actions towards someone else, and this might impact how others feel about you, whether that's positive or negative. And that can cause other people to behave a certain way towards you, and in turn reinforce your own beliefs about yourself. So if your actions are positive or nice towards someone else, well, they might believe that you're a nice person and in turn have positive, nice actions towards you. And that's just going to reinforce your positive beliefs about yourself. And this feeds back into the start and creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. However, if, again, these are more negative in nature, they can also feed into each other and reinforce those behaviors. So this is really kind of an important aspect in social psychology and interacting with other people, that how you behave and how you act towards others sort of creates this self-fulfilling prophecy loop in continuing that behavior and those attitudes towards others.